Allison Kanoti, from the Maine Forest Service, is going to give us a forest health update. Forward and back here, Allison.
Okay, terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you everybody for being here today, and okay. And appreciate the opportunity to be here. Mike Parizio was going to do this presentation. He actually put together the slideshow, so I'll be giving his slides, so we'll see how that goes. And Ray will hopefully keep me on track as far as schedule and everything. I'm Allison Kanoti. I'm the Director of Forest Health and Monitoring with the Maine Forest Service. I work here out of Old Town, Maine. And I'm going to give you just a brief overview of what was going on in the forest health world here in Maine last year. So first off, it's been quite a few years actually for defoliators in this region, including Maine. We had a spongy moth outbreak that had been going on for quite a few years, and that population did collapse, but we saw resulting mortality in the stands that were impacted in western Maine. We have brown-tailed moth populations that have been in outbreak conditions for more than 10 years, and that actually does continue, although populations are much reduced now. We also have winter moth defoliation, pretty much restricted to coastal regions. That's been going on since 2014 at least, so really long-term defoliation by that pest, and in some areas we're seeing quite a bit of tree mortality related to that. We have a forest tent caterpillar outbreak that's been ongoing in northern Maine for a number of years now, and now has spread to western Maine. And also we have spruce budworm populations building in northern Maine. So as is often the case, when one defoliator is behaving badly, many of them behave badly because some of the same conditions support their population growth for these outbreak-prone species. So looking just at spongy moth, for those of you who haven't heard that name, that is what is used for gypsy moth now. We had populations exploding in 2021 with tens of thousands of acres defoliated in Oxford County and also in the area around Jay. This was contiguous in the western Maine with defoliation in New Hampshire as well. It was also coincident with drought conditions in the region, so there's multiple stressors on those trees. We had that same level of defoliation the following year in 2022, and then we had significant disease seen in the tail end of 2022. In 2023, we had this big frost event, folks probably remember, where the trees just looked singed. So that's another stress on those trees, but it really obscured and also stalled a lot of that spongy moth defoliation. And so by 2023, we had pretty much collapse of those populations. And this last year, in 24, we mapped over 8,000 acres of tree mortality in the area that was affected. And that mortality wasn't just in the hardwoods that spongy moth prefers, like oak trees particularly, but also in softwoods because they had completely stripped their hardwood hosts and started feeding on hemlocks and white pine. Hemlock really doesn't do well with spongy moth defoliation. Oftentimes it's completely stripped, and white pine as well. We had some instances where needle elongation hadn't happened yet, so they had at least 1 year of needles, but those trees are significantly impacted. And if they aren't dead yet, some of them will die in the years to come. Looking at brown-tailed moth, we did have an overall population collapse, but I would say that it's not over for a number of people. So we kind of had a donut hole effect like we've seen in prior years, where the center of the infestation populations are really down, and along the edges populations are still kind of elevated. So especially around Sebago Lake, the west shore of Sebago Lake, we see some continued high populations of brown-tailed moth, and actually in this Penobscot Valley region as well, we see some higher populations of brown-tailed moth. So it's down but not out. So if you haven't already looked in your backyard, now's the time. They are going to be coming out on those webs momentarily, and it gets just harder to control them, more damaging to the trees if you're going to prune webs out. So definitely take some time this weekend, take a look for those webs. So this just looks at the defoliation caused by brown-tailed moth over time. And you can see that we had the outbreak really start to pick up in 2015. We kind of had a peak in 2021. Last year, we only mapped around 2,000 acres of damage, and that's in aerial survey flights that only picks up moderate to severe damage. So there's a lot more out there in sort of those lower level damage categories, and that's what we've seen in our winter web surveys. That's just a county. I'm going to go right through that. This shows all of our aerial survey damage polygons from 2019 to 2023. And so you can see the area on the right side of the map is kind of that Penobscot River Valley. And then on the left side of the map, really lit up is north of Lewiston. And so you can see that it was pretty widespread, the defoliation, in that period of time. And then this is our aerial survey damage polygons from this past year, from 2024. And if you have good eyes, you can see the speckles, again, up through the Penobscot Valley, in the Lewiston area, and then north of Augusta as well, and a little bit on Sebago Lake. So the populations are still out there, but they're much reduced. Looking at winter moth, as I mentioned, it's really a coastal defoliator at this stage. We do have a proven biological control for this insect. Unfortunately, the way that you raise the biocontrol is by raising it inside of the caterpillars, so it can be a little bit hard to harvest. But we have had some success in recent years. So in 2024, again, we saw quite a bit of defoliation in the mid-coast peninsulas. If any of you have been to Harpswell, that's kind of ground zero for this pest, and they had not only winter moth, but also brown-tail moth has been there really perennially. And so they have a lot of oak mortality in that peninsula, and it's true in some of these other sort of mid-coastal peninsulas of the state. And oftentimes when we're doing aerial survey, we see this defoliation centered around houses, because the way that people move this pest around is in soil with their landscape plantings, because it spends basically from June all the way through November in the soil in the pupal stage. So I mentioned the biological control. The biocontrol is a fly. It lays its eggs on partially chewed hardwood leaves, and then the winter moth caterpillar actually consumes its egg as it consumes the leaf. The egg will hatch once the caterpillar has pupated in the ground, and then start to eat the caterpillar pupa from the inside out, and eventually will pupate within the cocoon of the caterpillar. So when we go to get winter moth parasitoids, we actually will beat those hardwood trees where we have had releases. We'll collect thousands of caterpillars, rear them in 5-gallon buckets, and then ship them to Massachusetts for further rearing and dissection to pull out that parasitoid. We have had really good parasitism rates in Maine, and you can see the yellow kind of shows in the circles there, kind of shows where the parasitoids have established and the percent of the collected caterpillars that were parasitized. Down south, those purple circles are Rhode Island, so they had past parasitoid releases, but they really didn't have good establishment. So this spring, we're going to be working with them to collect as many caterpillars as we can as a group, so that we can hopefully share some of this biocontrol wealth with folks in southern New England. I had mentioned forest tent caterpillar being active for the last number of years. We really had our first damage mapped in 2021 of 240 acres. By the next year, we mapped about 17,000 acres. That nearly doubled in 2023 with 30,000 acres mapped. And then 2024, last year, we had over 60,000 acres mapped. The vast majority of that has been in aspen stands in northern Aroostook County. And it is kind of typical for Maine conditions that aspen is the primary host for forest tent. We see it on other hardwoods as well. A few years back, we had about 800 acres impacted in the Blue Hill region on oak. But in general, it really is something that we consider one of our aspen pests. However, this year we had some areas mapped. I don't know if folks see the spots over there in western Maine. in sort of the areas that are really high production sugar bushes in western Maine. So that was about 3,800 acres of the damage that was mapped last year was in those sugar bushes. And it's really something that we don't have a lot of records of if we look back through our old reports of this type of damage in sugar maple in Maine. Pretty common in New Hampshire and Vermont, New York, in their records. And I don't know if it's just because of where it is, because certainly it's probably been happening throughout time. So this just gives some overview of what the damage looks like in those primarily aspen stands in that settled area of Aroostook County. So if those of you who were up there, you know that by the first week of June, the aspen were bare, and then they refoliated pretty well. That is a stress. You're going to start to see large branch mortality and tree mortality as well if you have multiple years of this type of damage. And then this shows the area from a satellite image of defoliation in western Maine on those sugar bushes. And then this just overlays our aerial survey polygons on that same map. Those areas are planned, the land managers are planning treatments in those areas this year for forest tent caterpillar to help preserve the health of those sugar maple trees. And then the final defoliator I'll talk about is spruce budworm. This one is a native pest, again, sort of like, like forest tent caterpillar, it is a native pest that is outbreak prone. We have had a couple decades of outbreak of spruce budworm in parts of Canada, over in Quebec and now Ontario as well. And one of the ways that populations can be increased with this pest is through atmospheric transport of the adult moths. The moths have this behavior where they will lift up from the canopy of the forest in the evenings, and they are sometimes picked up and carried by atmospheric currents long distances. So moths that show up in our traps in Maine may come from Ontario or Quebec, places where the populations are a little bit higher. The map here shows a model of that movement from this past July, showing the different symbology. Basically, the yellow are the ones that landed and were alive, landed because of sunrise. And then the red are ones that landed but were dead. So it gives you an idea of the type of movement that can happen with these atmospheric transport events. And a lot of times in the past, since about 2014, 2013, we've seen these mass transport events show up in our traps. So pheromone trap data in 2023 started to, it actually has been showing for quite some time, this concentration of higher trap catches in the northwest corner of the state. And then in, this one's from 2023. 2024, our traps were not real successful in capturing moths, and we don't actually know exactly why. We don't know if there was something with the pheromone handling or potentially the traps themselves, or just that there are populations of moths that are competing with the traps that could have led to depressed catches in not only Maine, but also in New Brunswick as well. So this shows the 2023 trap catches as well as the defoliation data from Quebec for 2023. So you can kind of see that activity was really picking up on the border in 2023. And then in 2024, we had our first real significant mapping of defoliation from this pest since the collapse of the last outbreak. So we had about 3,000 acres mapped through our aerial surveys in far western Maine. Landowners reported defoliation in eastern parts of the state that they picked up from the air, and I think that for us, it was we were mapping quite a bit of the forest tent caterpillar at that time, and pretty busy with those tablets. This shows our defoliation surveys that were done in the area from the ground. In this case, we're using something called the Pest method that was established during the last outbreak. It's actually a little bit modified in that you can look at defoliation on each year of growth on those twigs. And the larger the circle there, the larger percent defoliation of those twigs. And so in this case, you take a 3-branch sample from the canopy and you quantify each shoot end as to the level of defoliation for that shoot. And we had some spots that were up over 70% in past years, but they've been really below 10% for those sites. Some of those are newer sites and areas where we had mapped that defoliation. And this just shows what things look like from the air. This is a contemporary photo just taken last July in the area around the Canadian border. And you can see again, this is what things looked like from the air with the border running right through that image. So familiar imagery for some folks who were around in the last outbreak, not something that we've seen in contemporary times here. The good news is that the damage was primarily just to the current year of growth on these trees. So it indicates a recent increase in populations. In some areas, there was feeding on older growth as well. But all of our sites where we took the defoliation samples on the ground were just in that current year feeding, not the older needle feeding. Some of that is due to harvests that took place in the areas that were most heavily hit last year that were seen from the air. So we didn't get out and get the surveys before the trees were on the ground. So the way that we classify, another way that we classify spruce budworm populations is using overwintering branch samples. So spruce budworm is an interesting insect in that it hatches in July or August and then transforms almost immediately to an L2, so the second instar larva. It doesn't feed, so unlike brown-tail moth, it doesn't feed at all after that transformation. It goes directly into hibernation. So we can classify or predict the following year's populations by looking at what's settled on the tree starting in that August period. And the way we do that is they are washed from the branches using a caustic solution. That's done by the University of Maine Spruce Budworm Lab that's funded both by CFRU partners and also by the U.S. Forest Service. And in the case of spruce budworm, landowners have recently formed a coalition called the Maine Budworm Response Coalition that is facilitating application of an early intervention strategy for spruce budworm management in Maine. And this is quite different from the approach in the last outbreak where we used a foliage protection strategy to keep trees alive in time for harvest. In this case, an early intervention strategy is focused on pushing down populations that are building towards and above an outbreak threshold that was recently defined through monitoring populations that were building in the Gaspé Peninsula in Quebec. And so they were able to define that outbreak threshold as 7 larvae per branch, which is quite a bit less than what we were talking about in the last outbreak when we were looking at population levels. And so management in this case happens as populations build towards that outbreak threshold, and it's done using targeted insecticides that affect caterpillars and conserve their natural enemies. So their natural enemies are other insects a lot of times, like wasps in particular. So the results from those L2 samples fed the map that you see on the slide here. And the areas in red are those that exceed that outbreak threshold. The areas in orange are also ones that exceed that outbreak threshold, but they're from that 7 larvae per branch up to about 40 larvae per branch. And the areas in yellow are those that are above 3.5 larvae per branch. And this model is from University of Maine Fort Kent professor Neil Thompson, and it is clipped to a modeled forest type from the University of Maine, Aaron Simons and Casey Lagarde. So these This area is an area that could be considered for treatment under the early intervention strategy for management. And in fact, about 240,000 acres of that is currently being proposed for treatment. Moving on to another invasive pest and not a defoliator. Emerald ash borer, as many of you know, has been active in Maine since just prior to 2018. That was when we had our first detections, both in northern and southern Maine. In northern Maine last year, our trapping surveys revealed a number of new towns with detections, and so the quarantine area was expanded around those detections. We're starting to see a more rapid spread in that area, and we're starting to see more areas where we have a one-year life cycle, whereas when populations were lower, we were seeing basically a 2-year life cycle. So we're hopeful that we can have better success now with establishment of biological controls that require that 1-year life cycle for establishment. So this shows you where we found emerald ash borer in northern Maine. And this is what it looks like in southern Maine. So this was also detected in 2018. The difference here is that it's a little bit warmer, and so it was already more prone to have that 1-year life cycle. And also it's building from that infestation that's been moving up from the south since the early 2010s. So it has a larger infestation that it's building from. All those red spots are where we have point level detections. There's a 3-mile radius on them. It's just expected that emerald ash borer is probably established within that 3-mile radius. And then the orange is a 10-mile radius. One of the things to be aware of is we don't really have great detection methods for emerald ash borer. So even though it's been known in the country since 2002, we still have pretty mediocre ways of finding it when it reaches a new area. So it's usually established for a number of years when we first do find it. And an example is that we've been doing survey on MDI since 2002, and we just had a detection this past year on the island by a licensed arborist. And it's an infestation that's pretty well established. So we have traps and trap trees there, but you really need to be surveying in the areas you're most concerned about in order to find it. So if you have a woodlot that you're concerned about, as far as knowing when emerald ash borer arrives, one of the tools that you could use is a girdled trap tree, and we have information about that on our website. And also on our website, we have this new emerald ash borer detection dashboard that shows you which towns we have detections of emerald ash borer in. And Mike's got outlined there Brewer, Maine. We have no detections in Brewer, Maine yet, but we do have detections in places like Herman, not too far from here. And the dashboard gives you a full list of all the towns with detections, so I encourage you to check it out if that's something that you're interested in. I also want to mention hemlock woolly adelgid. We had a range expansion for that pest. Hemlock products, we do have regulations on hemlock products, both rooted hemlock, so live trees, but also chipped or branch material, anything with branch material. So chips, or if you're just moving branches from a tree pruning effort, then those do have to either stay within the quarantine area or go to a facility that has an agreement to receive them. Quarantine area is much bigger than the known area of infestation. So just be aware that, just because you can plant hemlock from the infested area in places like Brewer, it doesn't mean that you should, because you can really easily move hemlock woolly adelgid on those live plants. It only takes one of them to move a population, one adelgid. And then finally, beech leaf disease is a newer arrival in Maine, and it has had a really rapid expansion of detection. I have my theories, and they're wacky theories and not scientifically valid, so I won't go into them. But we do have beech leaf disease detected in every county except Franklin County. We're saving that one for Patty Cormier. But seriously, if you're in Franklin County, keep an eye out for beech leaf disease. This is caused by a foliar nematode, and it's probably everywhere in these infested stands during certain times of years. There's probably gazillions of them in these infested stands, and it looks like they're just being moved around on air currents, but also potentially came in on plant material that was alive. And we don't really know what this is going to spell for the future of beech in our forests. We know it has impacts first to the understory and then eventually to the overstory. And damage accumulation seems to be a lot faster here in the east, where we have the concurrent beech bark disease as well as this beech leaf disease. And then finally, we do have regular conditions reports that if you are engaged in forestry, we really encourage you to sign up. There's a QR code down in the corner there that I think brings you to the page with that blue box if you aren't already signed up. They come out usually from May to October, once a month. And then because we're using this Gov delivery system, we do send out bulletins that are timely other times of the year as well. So with that, I think that's about my time, and I can take any questions.
Questions for Allison?
The question is, can you transport beech leaf disease? And yeah, the answer is probably. We really don't know very much about mode of transport. Like I said, the current theory is it's just everywhere in the air around you when the nematodes are outside of the leaves. And so, yeah, I could see how you could potentially pick it up, but it's probably being moved much more efficiently on wind currents and by birds and small mammals and that sort of thing. They've even done things like look to see if it survives in the digestive tract of birds, and it does. So if they're eating buds off of a beech tree, or if they're eating a caterpillar that ate a beech leaf, then potentially they could pick up and transport that nematode longer distances. I'd be more concerned about transport of hemlock woolly adelgid as a forester, especially during basically anywhere from early March through the end of July, when the eggs and crawlers are present, and again, in pretty great numbers, kind of like a dust particle in size. You can pick them up on your cruising vest or what have you, and carry them with you. And again, they're all female. It only takes one to find a hemlock twig to start a new population. Yeah, a question about injection of ash trees. So if you do have highly valued ash, and you're near a known infestation, then it really makes sense to think about treating that ash if you want to keep it on the landscape. And that is being done in many areas of Maine now. We generally don't recommend using pesticides until the insect has been found within about 5 or 10 miles of the tree that you're concerned about. But as I mentioned, we do have pretty cruddy detection methods. So again, if you have a high-value ash tree, think about putting in a trap tree in order to tell when emerald ash borer gets to your neighborhood. There is the ability of those injectables to actually have trees recover from a light infestation of emerald ash borer, but a lot of times trees can look really healthy until it's too late. So you really want to keep an eye on those trees. And then the other thing I'll mention is Maine Forest Service and other partners are injecting ash trees in the forest to try to maintain seed-bearing trees in those forest situations to help to preserve some of the pool of the genome that's still out there. In the back? There's actually 2 different products that are used in this early intervention strategy. One is BT, as you mentioned. That's a bacterial insecticide that is effective in caterpillars that have a basic gut chemistry. It's not effective against all caterpillars, but it is effective against spruce budworm. And then the other is tebufenicide, and that's sold under the trade name Mimic, and that's a hormone mimic. And so it actually interrupts the molting of the insect. And again, it's caterpillar specific. So both of those are effective products with this early intervention strategy where you're really trying to maintain those other insects in the environment in order to maintain the natural enemies. Mimic is a foliar spray, yep. Yep. The sugar maple will be treated with BTK, and so that actually has an OMRI label, an organic label. There's two different labels for the BTK that can be applied aerially. One is OMRI labeled and the other is not. And because of the food product, they tend to opt towards that OMRI labeled insecticide.
Thank you, Allison.